What's going on out there, YouTube? Garrett Blevins here again today to talk to you about a topic that is somewhat controversial, misunderstood, leads to a lot of arguments and a lot of confusion, whether it's in scientific research or the Reddit forums. Deloads. Look, everybody knows sort of what a deload is, but we don't have a single definition, whether in scientific studies or just in the broader community, of what makes a deload. What's the difference between a deload and a taper? What's the difference between a deload and a light week, or just the start of the next phase or block of training that you might be doing? I mean, there are so many gray areas that really this whole topic is rather confusing. So I'm going to try to pull back that curtain a little bit. I'm going to try and open up what is going on with deloads. Why do we do them? Do you even need to use one? Maybe you can have deloadless training. Yes, it is possible. And what does it mean to have a deload pre-programmed versus be reactive? So before I get into all that, I want to thank Evolve AI. As a team, we decided to sponsor this video series and give more training information to you all out there. I'm excited to say that Evolve AI has the opportunity now to have deload or deloadless training. You can actually select that based on your preferences, and the AI is going to recreate the training in the macro cycle so that if you don't need a deload and you've selected not to do that because you want to maximize your weeks of training, you can do so while also still having the opportunity to trigger a deload if you find yourself needing one. And honestly, I think triggering a deload reactively is probably the best way to do it, and I'll get into why starting now. So let's talk about deload types. We've got planned deload. So if you're familiar with the program series that I've been putting out, look at the 5-3-1 video. This is a classic example of a pre-programmed deload. You do your 5 AMRAP, your 3 AMRAP, your 1 AMRAP weeks, and then you deload. Now, I will say that Jim Wendler has put out more recently that maybe you shouldn't deload for all the beginning cycles. And that's because you start with a lower training max. So those first few runs through that 3-week wave really doesn't hit you that hard. So you might not need a deload, but let's just, for sake of argument, say the normal version of 5-3-1 where you deload every 4th week. When you pre-program them and it's set in stone for the structure, that's what's called a planned deload. Now, the advantages of planned deload is that you're not going to probably overwork in an organized training structure. You're getting your time to rest, to release that fatigue, and you know you're going to get it, so you're less likely to overtrain. But the con is that you might not need the deload. And what that means is if you're taking every 4th week off and you actually don't need it, there's a lot of training weeks left on the table. And those start to add up when you think about a year, 3 years, 5 years of training where you're deloading 25% of the time every 4th week. That's a lot of lost training time and gains left on the table. So the next type of deload that you might look into is a reactive deload. And what a reactive deload's fancy way of saying, hey, you take one when you need one. There's 2 great examples of that within template-based programs. One is StrongLift's 5x5, and the other is the GZ-CLP method. Now, both of these do it a little differently. The StrongLift's 5x5 uses a reactive deload that then is followed when that deload is not sufficient enough to continue the linear progression. Then you start changing the training protocols. The GZ-CLP goes the other way, where you change the training protocol first and then you do the deload afterwards. Here's what I mean. So when you stall out on StrongLift's 5x5, again, watch that video if you don't know the program, it'll make a little bit more sense. If you stall out and you fail to do your 5x5, let's say you get like 5 reps on the first set and then 5 again, but then 4, 4, and then 3, you would drop 10% of whatever weight you used, and then you would use that for your next workout, and you would try to break through whatever plateau you hit. So if you failed to do your 5x5 with 200 pounds, you're going to drop that back to 180, and then you're going to do 5x5s again and try to get up, past 200. Maybe you get to 210 or 215 before you fail, and then you would drop 10% again. But when you do that a couple of times where you drop back and you come forward but you hit the wall, then you actually change the training protocol from 5x5 to 3x5. So you're dropping 2 sets, and that should be a lot more sustainable. You should be able to make all your sets with 5 reps because you've lowered your overall volume, and that's going to allow you to release some of that fatigue and then show that actual fitness and that strength that you've been developing this whole time. Once you do the same thing, again, trying to back off 10%, hit the wall, back off 10%, hit the wall, can't get past, you'll drop to a 3x3, so now you're dropping the reps, until finally you drop to 1 set of 3 and then 2 sets of 3 at minus 5% from the top set. So you're going to do back off sets at that point with less weight. So what's happening here is you're deloading with a 10% drop on intensity before you start dropping volume by changing the protocol. That's how StrongLift's advised to do it. So What's the other way that you can do a reactive deload? Well, that's the GZCLP method. What happens there is you're basically doing 5 sets of 3 plus. The last set of 3 is an AMRAP. So if you're not making your AMRAP or you're failing your sets, what you would do is then you would move to the next protocol, which would be 6 sets of 2. So as you can tell, 15 working reps, here you got 12 working reps. So you're dropping the volume down by adjusting the set and rep protocol all the way down to 10 singles with an AMRAP on that last single. Once you fail throughout that progression, then you deload by taking really what's a little bit more like a taper, a 2 to 3 day rest period from that lift, retesting your 5 rep max, and then using 85% of that 5 rep max to restart another round of 5 sets of 3 plus, and you recycle through. Again, if you're not familiar with the GZCLP, check out the video on that. So a reactive deload is going to be situational. You're going to take it when you need it. Hopefully within your program, there's something that can trigger that, whether it's readiness scores, whether it's you're just taking, and by readiness scores, what I mean by that is you're doing something daily where you've got a checklist and you're monitoring your readiness and you're seeing trends. And if you see that dip way down deep, that's how you're going to know, hey, my performance is suffering. I might be heading toward an injury. Maybe I should take a deload right now. Again, another nice thing about Evolve AI is we track all that for you. We have readiness scores that are before you start a workout, after you do a workout, at the end of the week, and even after a block or after a meet, you're going to check in and tell the system how you're doing. It takes care of all that so that you can not have to worry about manually tracking that on paper or in some separate app. You can do everything right where you're doing your training. So when you're looking at reactives, it's when you need it. This is probably the best way to trigger a deload rather than pre-planning it. Although some people like the structure and the pattern of pre-planned deloads, it's not that one is right or wrong. You just need to figure out what works best for you. And best way to do that is actually to kind of try some training with each of them. The third option for deloads is no deload. And that's like something like the cube method. Again, there's a video on that. Basically, if you're not going to deload at all and you're not even going to have a reactive deload system, what you need to do is bake the deload in. So the way you're going to do that is by having an undulating style of training or phases that have easy weeks at the beginning of them, like transition weeks that head in. Here's how the cube method does it. Basically, there's a heavy day, a rep day, and a speed day. And the speed day is going to be every third time you're exposed to a lift, and it's effectively a deload. So you are deloading, but not exactly, because there's not a whole week dedicated to it. That's okay. The whole point is you're trying to keep your fatigue at a reasonable level so that you're not overtraining or you're not getting so stuck in the same type of training monotony that you acclimate to it and you're not making any progress because your training is too similar. Oftentimes, deloads signal the end of a training protocol where you then move into something else. Again, that's what you're kind of seeing here with strong lifts where the actual protocol changes. But if you're in a block programming style where you have distinct blocks or phases, oftentimes the deload will be stationed right in between block 1 and block 2, where your reps or your sets or your volume or something is changing between those to continue to drive gains. So you could have no deload, reactive, or planned. The main point, deloads and tapers release fatigue to allow for higher display of fitness. And what I mean by fitness in strength sports, your fitness is how much weight you can lift. Specifically in powerlifting, your fitness is your ability to display your 1 rep max ability in the squat, bench, and deadlift at a meet. But whatever it is, that's why you deload. You're trying to diminish the fatigue that is masking your actual ability. And when I talk about that, you're going to do it 2 ways, either lower volume or lower intensity or both. You can do one or the other or both. Again, strong lifts 5x5, you're first dropping the intensity, then you're dropping the volume. GZCLP, you're dropping the volume, then you're dropping the intensity. But you could also do them simultaneously. There's no reason you need to do just one or just the other. It just depends. And this is the whole thing about defining what a deload is and the difficulty of going to scientific literature and trying to compare apples to oranges because we do not have an agreed upon set, this is how you deload. Within Evolve AI, we take volume and intensity down in the pre-planned deloads, as well as a triggered deload. Again, because we're trying to release that fatigue as fast as possible to make sure that you can then have a super compensation that is shown, or you just avoid injury because you've been overtraining a little bit too much. Either of those are reasons to do it. Now, here's what's undergirding this whole process. And this is often called like the SRA curve, the stimulus, recovery, adaptation. So for us, you have a training stimulus, which is a workout, which creates fatigue. Then as a result, your body says, wow, the stimulus that I received caused some damage. Needs to adapt to that. So as you recover properly, you're adapting to whatever this training stimulus was, and your body should get a little stronger. Think of it as like the challenges where you're going from couch potato, not doing anything, and you start doing 100 body weight squats a day, which sounds awful, but let's imagine you did that. Well, the first time you did it, you wouldn't be able to walk the next day. You'd be in horrible pain, and the day after that would be even worse. But maybe by the third day, you can crawl around and start trying to do something and do another round of that. But the next time you do it as part of the repeated bout effect, it's not going to be as painful. Your DOMs aren't going to last as long. And eventually you're going to be able to do 100 body weight squats a day with no problem at all. But you're also going to top out where you're not going to be able to continue to make progress. You're not going to get stronger. Your legs aren't going to get bigger. You're not going to get more fit because you've adapted to that stimulus. So what would you do? Well, that's when you go put a barbell on your back. You stop doing 100 reps because that's insanity. And you start getting on a progressive overloading stimulus so that you make this training harder and harder. What this looks like, if you take this chart here, you're going to have that super compensation where you adapt, and you would place another training stimulus somewhere along this process. Now, you wouldn't want to have another training day when you're at your lowest, most fatigued point. That's going to dip you down further. But anywhere along the recovery or where you start to have super compensation, you would want to have another training stimulus. Now, it depends on where you're at in your athletic career, how close or if you want to be at that peak before you do that. In fact, getting that super compensation often doesn't just come from one training stimulus, because as you adapt further and further and further to the type of training that you're doing, you actually need more and more training stimulus to actually get to the point where you can pop back over the previous baseline you're at. But I won't get too far into that. That's not the point. What is the point is that as you follow this SRA curve, whether it's training stimulus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, eventually your progress on that will stagnate. And often at that point, especially if you think about like whether that was on 531 or whether I was on Strongless 5x5 or GZCLP, you have just been grinding through some maximal weights where you're failing AMRAPs in the case of those programs. So you were working at very high RPEs before you failed. So not only have you flatlined because your stimulus is no longer effective, you also have incurred a lot of fatigue, and you need to release that fatigue so that you can start your next cycle. Now, as you release the fatigue and you rest, you're not having a stimulus that drives adaptation, and that's why there's going to be some regression as part of that. When you're not training and you're just releasing fatigue, your capacity and your fitness will increase. But eventually, as you rest, as we all know, you will detrain and come back down. So a deload needs to be structured. Usually they're a week. We just, as human beings, seem to think in that term. Sometimes they're two, though. It just depends how deep of a hole you've dug yourself into with fatigue. But as you go through this, you don't want to deload too long. You don't want to deload too aggressively. You don't want to do absolutely nothing. Deloads don't mean no training. It means easier or different training than what you've been doing to allow the fatigue that you've accumulated to dissipate. And that's going to give you a good base to start with in your next cycle. So what it should look like if we were to continue this instead of flatlining with the same stimulus over and over, you started here at this level of strength. Let's say you take a deload week on 6 and your fitness does, drop a little bit, but this is the new starting point, This is the new base that you're going to be beginning from, and you can start your next phase of training. And really, it'd be good if the next phase of training had a different training stimulus than what you got over from, because 1 week of deloading isn't going to completely resensitize your body to whatever you were doing before. Again, this is why, as you see after a deload has either been non-successful or before you even get to a drop in intensity, there's a change in your volume and your intensity and the rep ranges that you're using, because that novel stimulus is going to continue your progress so that you can continue to stair step up, and you should be stacking your blocks together to repeat that over and over. The role of a deload is simply to keep that process going, to mitigate the chance of injury, to resensitize you to training, to give you a mental and physical break to lower fatigue so that you can display your fitness, but also so that you're ready to start hard training again. If you deload or you taper into a meet, you want to show your maximal strength. But if you're deloading into another block, you want to be as ready as possible for that next block. And that's where having an organized training methodology is really important. Again, something we work on really hard at Evolve AI, whether it's block programming, whether it's DUP programming, whether it's inserting an off season, you need to have those options and you need to have a cohesive training plan. So If you got this far in the video, please make sure to like the video. It helps the channel out a lot. If you're not subscribed, come on, what are you even doing here? Subscribe to the channel. And I hope wherever you're at, you're doing well. Blessings.